I would like also to welcome the participants that we have online. I don't know how many, but we have also participants that are following you. And it is an honor to introduce our invited speaker, Mirabelle Muûls, that she is an associate professor at the Imperial College, and she is a distinguished and well-known researcher. She is known for her work on carbon markets, but also mostly on the impact of environmental and energy policy on the performance of firms. And I'm sure that today we will be inspired from your insights that you will present. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to disclose it's my first keynote speech, and I'm feeling very humbled when looking at the list of the past 10 workshops. So I'll do my best, and I'm not reassured by the fact there was no coffee and delicious food, so I won't feel bad if you fall asleep. Last time I gave a talk to such an audience, I came just after a nuclear scientist. That's the joys of being at the Imperial College, who was basically reassuring us that his research would save the world in about 40 years. I'm not sure I can say the same of my research, but I'll do my best to convince you that the work we are all doing is really important to shape the future and the future of our children. Given I have 4, I have a lot of work to do. So I thought that today I would give you an overview of research I've been busy with an amazing set of co-authors. So it's not one paper with that many co-authors, which would create a lot of coordination costs, but several projects that we've been working on through the years, and so I thank them for all of the fun we've had. When we think about addressing climate change, sorry for the first typo, the world we are in today, in particular this year, is a worrying world. There's a lot of information coming out, which isn't always reliable, and that's why I think our role is important. 2024 is, for good or bad, a year of elections. We heard earlier how elections can lead to policy changes, which can actually go in both directions. And so even more important in such a year, to have solid foundations of what we need to know about climate policies and think innovatively about how to design policies that can lead to a better society. And this question of climate policies, it's not new. People in this room have been working on it for many years and are experts on every type of policies we can think of. And in the recent years, every region of the world has been thinking of new policies or revised policies, and obviously the elephant in the room, or not, and really the game changer here has been the Inflation Reduction Act. And I look forward to the many papers to come on the impact it will have had on emissions, on innovation, etc. So we're all economists working on the environment and energy, so we understand why, as the biggest market failure, there's a role for government intervention, and even if there is a role, when and how should governments intervene is an important thing to ask ourselves. And once we think intervention is needed, ex post, we should be measuring how it has affected behavior, economic behavior. And, you know, economists love to disagree and find ways to discuss and debate, but I think one agreement we have is that pricing carbon and internalizing the social cost of climate change is something that we should be thinking about seriously. And actually, reassuringly, market-based instruments are on the rise, and globally they are growing geographically, but also in terms of the sectors covered, the price being reached. And so here you can see the most recent trends in carbon prices, in particular in the EU, where the price has reached levels that no one would have expected this fast. So what I will do today is first show you some of our results answering the question, does a carbon market lead to emission reductions, which we feel is the first order questions, and then understanding what firms do to comply with this new regulation. The third question is, you know, if we do find reductions, which we do, are they just a displacement of emissions? Is it just carbon leakage? And how does the design of the market matter? And then I'll do, if I have time left, I'll do a small look into the firm's black box by showing you results of a management survey that we ran. So whether a cap and trade scheme is going to be leading to emission reductions is really a question of regulatory stringency, and as we know, the problem is we don't have the measure of what would have happened if the cap didn't exist. So if the price is non-zero, which it has been in many of the carbon markets, that's already a signal that it's binding. But of course, you know, whatever the way that the firms are going to react is going to change whether they are undermining the efficacy of the market or not. The question remains as to, you know, if a country acts unilaterally in imposing a cost of carbon on firms, is that going to lead to global emission reductions or just a reallocation of production and emissions? So the EU trading system, which many of you in the room are experts on, but I'll still do a quick reminder, was the first and is still by far the largest international system for trading CO2 emissions. And it was implemented in 2005 and is now in its fourth phase. It covers more than 11,000 power plants and manufacturing installations, and now the EU and also aviation, and the EU is now expanding the ETS into an ETS2 that will cover even more sectors. So just a health warning is that the research I'm going to present is focusing on the early years, what now looks like the early years of the ETS. But some of our new research and of many of you here is now looking at what has been happening since 2018 with this tremendous price increase. And so I hope there will be a new Atlantic workshop in 10 years and we can look at the higher prices. So in this first paper I'll tell you about, we've been looking at the French manufacturing sector. I'm Belgian, so admiring the French statistical services who have been collecting since way before the ETS was implemented the annual energy consumption by fuel of plants in the French manufacturing sector. So we match that data with financial data about firms, with customs data about the products and destinations a firm is importing from, and with a survey for a subsample on the spending that firms do in protecting the environment. And all of that we match to the EU transaction log, which is the market's data set of who is receiving allocations, part of the market, trading, etc. And as you see on the graph on the right, the ETS firms are obviously very different to non-ETS firms. But thanks to this wealth of data that we have, we are able to match on emissions, value added, employment, capital, imports, share of gas, sector, etc., to come up with very comparable firms, some of which are in the ETS and others not. And so the great news is that we find that firms reduce their emissions as a result of the ETS, and having found that result, we spent 5 years trying to make sure we were right, because we knew it was going to be an important result. The result that comes with it is, okay, great, they are reducing their emissions, but are they actually drowning economically? And what we find is that they are not affected in their performance, whether it's employment or value added, and on the contrary, the carbon intensity of their production is decreasing. From that point, we thought, okay, what is driving this result? And to look at that, we were able to think of several potential mechanisms. So the first one was that the way we interpret it is that firms, once they are faced with the cost of carbon, the incentive to do an investment into a new production process becomes valuable. And so by facing that price of carbon, they make that investment that we observe through a not perfectly significant but increase in capital stock. And for the firms that are in the survey on the investments on pollution control, we find that they increased investment in integrated systems to reduce their emissions and what is called specific investments. And so looking at those aggregate savings, we find that we can explain 1/3 of the decrease in French manufacturing emissions to be due to the ETS. So what this graph shows you, the black line shows you the observed emissions in France since 1996 to 2012, which is when our data stops. The gray line is what our estimates give us as what the emissions would have been had there not been any ETS. And the dotted line is the emissions in 2000. So to that, one might think, okay, but at what price did that happen? And thanks to Ken's paper, we were able to compare the cost of those emission reductions. So by taking the maximum carbon price in phase 2, which was $52 equivalent, and thinking we want to make the cost as high as possible, and or the average price was $21 per ton, and multiplying that by the emission reductions achieved, what we find is that well, not multiplying that, sorry, that cost, if we compare it to all these other policies, the EU ranks 7th, the EU ETS ranks 7th out of the 25 policies summarized. And if you think of some of the numbers we heard this morning, this seems a very valuable policy to achieve the reductions, and at these low prices and early market design ways. So the other mechanism we would wonder about is whether there was just carbon leakage. So to look at this carbon leakage, we looked at the imports of firms. So the first measure we looked at is, did firms just outsource part of their production out of Europe, for example, maybe the most emissions intensive parts, and then import back the inputs that would have been outsourced, and we don't find that. And then we constructed the carbon intensity of their imports. So for each product, or each sector of the product they were importing, we took a measure of how carbon intensive that product was. And again, we find no effect of being in the ETS. Then another channel that could have taken place is that many of the ETS firms are multinationals. And so what could be happening is that their emissions in Europe and their production, their emissions are decreasing and their production is stable, but they are actually growing, but instead of growing in Europe, they are growing outside Europe. So in another paper, we took the data from the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, where there are about 1,000 multinationals, and there are many more now, and each multinational will report what proportion of their carbon emissions were made in each region. So we know whether they're in Europe, outside Europe, or even it's disaggregated by other countries. And so the question we were asking is, did the ETS and the participation of these multinationals in the ETS lead to firms increasing their share of non-ETS, non-European emissions? And the answer is no. So they did not increase their emissions. It's not always easy to show a non-result. So again, we spent a lot of time doing that, but we find no carbon leakage by multinationals. And concluding that there was no evidence that the competitiveness of EU firms was being threatened. So there's a large literature, which I won't go into too many details, about how to design emissions trading markets. And in particular, in the case of the EU ETS, the first phases were the allocation of permits was made for free for many sectors based on certain criteria of the risk of carbon leakage. And so what's interesting to know is, does the allocation of permits for free, will that affect the reaction of firms? So if the independence property would hold, the ETS price will matter for efficiency, but the allocation matters for the distribution of wealth. So the market finds the most efficient way to use the scarce carbon, and that will make the economic pie as big as it can be. And then how this pie is distributed doesn't really, is irrelevant. And so in theory, the permit allocation shouldn't affect the choice of firms and the pollution or the emissions of firms. But empirically, this is quite difficult because the allocation that was given for free depended on historic emissions. So this is still work in progress, but we used the transition from phase 2 to phase 3 in the ETS, where the rules for the allocation of permits were changed. And this change in policy was announced in 2009. And so we separate firms who continue to receive free permits from those in blue, so those are in blue, to those that didn't. And we see that without free permits, emissions by those firms would have been on average 16% lower. So it's an interesting behavioral economics or firm dynamics question. Some of the explanations we could think of would be some lacking salience of the ETS, and it would be interesting to see how the recent price increase might have reduced this gap, or credit constraints by firms might mean that they can't respond efficiently to the ETS. Yes?
Yeah, clarifying question. 16%, you're tightening the cap? That's what you mean? You would now tighten the cap? Or
no, so just they would have to buy their permits on auctions.
So these are for the ones that are, okay, I see.
They are in the ETS, but some receive their permits and some don't. And we find that those that don't, but they are all facing the same price, yeah. Okay, good. So I thought going into understanding within firms that are treated, there is obviously a lot of heterogeneity. And by understanding better how firms adjust and which firms adjust better to the carbon market, or which firms reduce their emissions the most, policymakers can design policies that complement each other. So we collaborated with colleagues in China to look at the pilot ETS in Beijing and Hubei, whereby in 2011, the cap and trade for carbon emissions was officially adopted. I'm wondering if there's a typo. Anyway, in 2021, the first phase of the Chinese ETS was launched. It was a pilot, including 2,300 power companies. Go back. They announced that in 2021, they would put a nationwide carbon market that would cover 40% of China's emissions. But before doing that, they did a pilot ETS. So the Chinese pilot market was focusing on power and heat, cement, chemicals, iron and steel, and some non-industrial sectors. So very similar to the ETS. And so what we did is we interviewed 216 firms, which doesn't seem like much, but I can tell you it's a lot, where half of them were ETS firms. So to do this, we adopted an approach that we had run in the EU before, building on the management interviews of Bloom and Van Reenen. But instead of asking general management questions, we asked the firms elements of how they implement, for example, energy measurement, energy targets, emissions targets. Do they have someone in charge of climate change? Do they reward participants? Is it part of the strategy, etc.? And so we find that firms in China regardless of whether they are state-owned or not, have very similar patterns in the link between management practices and performance. So, for example, better managed firms are more productive, they are more energy efficient, they are less prone to bankruptcy, etc. And so on top of that information, albeit with a small sample, we had half of those firms that were in a pilot ETS and the other half not. And so we looked at what the impact of the ETS had been. And we found that firms that had better management practices as a result of the ETS that came into force in 2011, those that had good climate management practices reduced their coal use as a result of the ETS, whereas those that were above median in terms of their management didn't change their consumption of coal. And so the conclusion of that was to say, well, you know, a carbon market can work, but it will work even better if it comes with information to firms, in particular in a context where some of the treated firms might not be very large or very informed, and that with the carbon market, giving them the tools to know how to manage this type of policy can really make a difference in this case. So, as I said, I talk quite fast, and I will have plenty of time for questions and coffee. So, to conclude, the ETS reduced carbon emissions in the EU and in France with no detectable bad impact on jobs or value added. And this was achieved by the adoption of technologies, and we find no evidence of carbon leakage. We also find that it's a policy, in this case, that was cost effective compared to other policy options, and that allocation of permits and market design matters. And then finally, that there can be complementary effects of management practices. What I'm happy to discuss is what are the open questions, what is the road ahead, in particular in a context where we all hope there will be more carbon pricing around the world. So one is to look at the more recent years, what happened once the prices went up. Did it lead to to carbon leakage, to more innovation, etc. Another big element that is coming into play is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So for those who don't know what that is the EU realizing that these high prices might lead to carbon leakage, have put in place a mechanism that is now already in its trial phase and will come into force in a bit over a year, whereby imports of certain goods of certain sectors will pay a levy that is proportional to their carbon content. And this will depend on where the good was produced, and it will depend on the policy in place, the policies in place, and the carbon price that this product would have faced at its production stage. So of course, I remember when I was a PhD student and someone would talk about CBAMs, we would all think they were dreaming. So for economists, this seems like an amazing achievement that we can even think about designing such a policy, but it comes with a host of questions on how do we measure the carbon content, and how do we measure the policies that, or the carbon price that production will have faced. And not the least, I spoke about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think we all can foresee a big debate as to having been in a country producing an input that was produced in a country with the IRA will be equivalent to having paid a carbon tax. I think we would all agree it isn't, but I think that policymakers will try and make sure that it is. So interesting days ahead where I see many avenues for research. Another linked question is, a lot of the literature has focused on how firms that were directly impacted by the ETS reacted, innovated, changed their production, their emissions, etc. However, in a globalized world, or even in our current economic framework, firms don't work in isolation, and very often the innovation that a firm will benefit from will not be made in-house. It will come through either its inputs or even directly by buying innovation from others. And so by isolating our research on firms that were directly regulated, we are not measuring some potentially many other benefits of the ETS. So to give you an example, this is part of some work in progress we're working on at the National Bank of Belgium, where I'm a fellow at. And we have data on B2B transactions between firms. So we know for every firm what it is buying from another Belgian firm, or not what, we know how much it is buying from another firm, and which firm, and what it is importing and exporting. So this gives us I was very excited to start to learn how to do a drawing of a network, and the green dots, which might not appear very neatly, are the ETS firms. So not many ETS firms in Belgium, because you can barely see them, but if we look upstream, the number of firms that are serving and that are selling something to an ETS firm, that represents 27% of Belgian firms. So although we're only a small proportion of firms are regulated, 27% are selling something to them. And if you take the second stage of upstream, there's a very strong greenness in my drawing. If you go downstream, so who do ETS firms sell to? Interestingly, so you can see the black lines are very strong relationships, so potentially more groups, but again, 27% of firms are buying from an ETS firm. And again, second stage, a bit less, but some very clear link to the whole economy, really, of by regulating only a few firms. So I think I can have a second career in art, but before that, I'm really excited about our work, where we are going to dig into what these links mean to firms' productivities, but even more importantly, potentially, what it means for the innovation incentives. Because if we think that the ETS brings down emissions, we also wanted to set the path for even more important emissions to net zero. So another line of research that I think is important is that as much as we love France, it's only one country, And there are many other countries who now have had ETSs in place. So we're working, Ulrich Wagner is leading a network of European researchers who have access to firm-level data. So if you're not in that network and you have access to firm-level data in Europe, join the network. The idea is that we use the same codes on similar data for each time confidential data, and in order to extract the differences between the reactions to the ETS depending on the structure of the economy, the sectors, etc. Another road ahead, and which I think many have been thinking of for some time, is to think about the overlap of policies. In the UK, for example, the regulatory framework is very complex. There are many firms will be subject to the UK ETS, which is one thing they kept after Brexit, is an ETS price, but also to other policies. And so understanding how these policies interact, I think, can be very interesting. In some of my other work, we've been thinking about credit constraints and how access to credit has a major impact on green investment into green technologies or production modes. And so thinking about these interactions with the carbon price could be interesting to look at. When I talk about my work on carbon markets, a lot of my students, before they take my class, of course, think I'm talking about voluntary carbon markets. And I think this last year or two has really seen a big growth in interest in voluntary carbon markets, in particular with the increase in the number of firms that are making pledges on their net zero or route to 2050, 2030, etc. And so these voluntary carbon markets are attracting a lot of investment and also a lot of interest. And so I think understanding how, if, whether voluntary carbon markets and regulatory carbon markets need to be linked or could be linked or not, I think is in a first step a theoretical question, but also potentially an empirical question to come. In the same way, if we look at the EU ETS and where it is heading to, there is going to be a point where the number of permits that are issued every year is close to zero. And so where do we move from there? So once we are close to zero, what happens to the market? I think, again, that requires some thinking ahead. In the same way as we had phase one that was considered the test phase, we probably want to be thinking about what will be phase, the new ETS when we get close to zero. And then finally, innovation. I haven't talked so much about it because so far my research didn't include it as much, but I think it's a key element. I'm lucky to work at Imperial College where innovation is really at the center of what we do, and economists are a bit of the sideshow, but it's actually a very exciting thing to observe is how vibrant green innovation is. And so for us to be thinking about what are the mechanisms within firms, within policies, to bring that innovation that is so crucial, I think is also a very important place to be, in particular with the development of ways to measure innovation that are growing with data science, etc. So thank you very much, and yeah, we have work to do.
Thank you, Mirabelle, for this very interesting overview on the impact of the carbon markets on the emissions, but also on the impact on the firm performance. I appreciated also this idea of opening the black box of the firms. I think this is really from a behavioral economics point of view is very, very interesting. And also the last slide, this morning I was mentioning, we are here also to be inspired, to get some new ideas, new research ideas. And I think the last slides was very interesting from this point of view. Now we have, she anticipated, I will not use all the time. So we have a lot of time for interesting discussions. Pedro, and then Yvonne, Pablo, and Xavier. Pedro. Okay.
Thank you for this very interesting and exciting presentation, particularly the open research question. But I was interested in the first part of the study. I'm not sure if I missed it, but when you look at the sample of companies you're looking at to see whether the ETS has actually worked, I understand you're not including power companies, only manufacturing companies, right?
Yes, exactly.
And then the second question is, do you observe any heterogeneity within the sectors? I mean, are sectors within manufacturing reducing emissions faster? Because in some past research, what we have observed is that there are some sectors like, I don't know, brick making, for example, which is basically small companies which are not able to deal with ETS, so they're not reducing anything, they're taking and other sectors are much more active, much more involved into ETS trading, so they understand what they need to do. So it has to do also with your analysis of the implications of permit allocation, because that's what also explains why some companies are reacting, some others not. What is your feeling or your results on these differences between sectors? Thank you.
So thank you. We did spend some time looking at the different sectors. We were a bit constrained in our sample size. So what we didn't find is that it was driven purely by one sector. So we tried a combination of sectors, and we do find, I think, that chemicals are driving some of it. But there, I would have to look again. But yeah, we looked at, in the constraints of our data, we looked at that. And in terms of allocation, we also tried to do that, but in the end, again, we were not able to do that because the phase we are looking at, there is not as much heterogeneity in the allocation, and so that's why with the newer data, the work in progress I showed you, where in between phase 2 and phase 3 there was this change, then we can exploit that change much better.
Work?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question which is a little bit related with what Pedro was saying about sectors, but my worry is a little bit more about regions, about distributional effects. Because when you look at what we call the old industrial regions, the photograph is completely different. I mean, you see some regions that they have had quite a huge impact due to the carbon market. So I wonder if you have any comments on that, or otherwise I will suggest to include it in the list of open research questions that you have proposed. Thank you.
Definitely. So we didn't, it's a good area we could add to. In particular, I think that's why we're doing the pan-European work, where we will have a larger pool of regions and data. What we did do was but it was more of an exercise to see whether the reduction in emissions was stronger was due to the recession, basically, in 2008 and 9. And so we looked at within France, the areas that had suffered the most in terms of unemployment from the recession. And we find that this didn't drive any change in the reduction in emissions. So it's not exactly addressing your question, but we would have maybe some way of looking, but a bit like the sectors we're constrained in. But thank you. I'll add it to the list.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I'm intrigued with these results that you mentioned, that permit holders, meaning those firms that had too many permits, they were not reducing as much. Because I understand here you have banking. And banking can go, can be anywhere. So I don't know how you can say for sure that you are holding that you are reducing too little if you have a large bank, unless you have information on marginal abatement costs. If you don't have that information, it's very hard to say whether you are abating little or more, because the banking has to be somewhere. It could be in this firm, that firm, that firm. And you don't know. There are too many degrees of freedom here. Yeah. So you need to have data on marginal abatement costs to say that these firms are abating below or less than what would be efficient. So I don't know exactly how you did it, but with banking, things are very tricky.
But so how would you explain that those that are receiving permits for free, more,
they are banking them for the next phase.
Yeah, but so they are not.
You need to establish that the price,
no,
the
so
actual price.
As I said, we're exploring what drives this difference, and banking could be one of them. But
because
what we
a little bit of transaction costs, allow you to keep the bank in your own account instead of trading that. And that doesn't mean that you are not being efficient. That's why I'm intrigued. Without banking, I take it for sure, for granted. But you are right. But with banking, I think it's much more difficult to estimate.
Actually, we can measure banking, so we should check
but the
that.
bank can be anywhere. We can have different banking levels, and still this is efficient.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's an open question. If one firm could do all the banking, or many firms.
Yeah.
Both will be equally efficient. So it's that's why I think tricky. That's why I'm wondering how you did it. But we can talk later. I'm intrigued.
Good. No, it's a good point. I'll have a think about it.
Yes, Mirabelle, thank you very much for your presentation. After these 20 years, I assure you that it was one of the
That's
nice
very kind
and
of you.
good keynote presentations. Thanks a lot. So I have a curiosity and then perhaps a reflection on what's happening with us and the transmission of this information. The first curiosity is on shadow carbon pricing, because when I talk to companies, this year in Spain, many of them are really big companies. They have these schemes in operation, and they claim that they are doing very well with these schemes, changing portfolios, etc. Can you give us some feedback on this, on your opinion? We actually have today one person from Acciona, one big company, and they actually have this system in place for many years.
So I think it's a very interesting point, because there are many sectors that are not in the EU ETS, and that to make their investment decisions, they would have be integrating an internal price of carbon. In addition to that, I think there is a big interest in these internal carbon prices when thinking of the financial market. So a firm like Acciona probably doesn't have, I think building a renewable energy might not be they won't be subject to the regulatory ETS, but for their investments, they are taking that into account. And a lot of firms will say that's the way forward. We are actually asking governments to regulate so that we can make the right investments into that. I think the problem is that the incumbent firms, they are probably those that are going to be regulated, and that will resist the policy being too binding, by saying with reason potentially that if they are hit too hard, they will go and produce somewhere else. So I think, that's one element, is firms either anticipating or making sure that they are compliant with their own commitments, that they are using an internal carbon price. I think what has been very interesting is looking at financial markets, where in the US there has been a huge backlash on ESG, but where in Europe it's at the center of conversation. So where the investment funds or banks would not be too concerned 10 years ago. They are now, every important bank in London has a climate department, whether it's on the physical risk, and Simon can tell us more, or on the transition risk and the cost of carbon and that risk in their portfolio. So I think that's sort of another driving force. We hope is that the investment, the requirements by investors, institutional investors, will also drive firms to have an internal carbon price if they are not being regulated, just to think ahead and be compliant either with their strategy or their investors' demands.
Sorry, and the reflection, the final reflection, it was on the fact that, I mean, we know this is an essential instrument. We knew it before its implementation even. Now we have empirical results which are strong, and you presented us a range of findings that are clear on the benefits of this approach. And also on the need for this approach, because I cannot imagine a decarbonized world without proper pricing. I mean, even if the engineers or other people think that or the nuclear guy think that they have the solution to our problems, right? But the question is, how can this be explained to the audience outside our bubble, in a way? Because I remember I was in the European Parliament like 10 years ago, very low prices, in a committee explaining to the MEPs on a reform on the European emissions trading system, and I was really, it was incredible what I found there. Everybody was talking about the end of their activities, if some extra stringency, the level was really, really low, the level of pricing. So how can we advance with this? Because some of these people, the regulated companies or lobbies, etc., are really saying that these systems are really
So
bad.
I think, at least I hope, because I tend to be an optimist, that the EU experience, what it has shown is that those that were quite loud at the start probably made a lot of money, the fat cats of carbon, and that data analysis would probably be able to show that, because they received so many permits for free, and we find that it didn't affect. It would require some good causality extraction, but I think what's very impressive is that the EU is actually growing their carbon market to all the other sectors. And so I think the crucial question is, how do we bring other countries to the same? And on that list, we should probably ask ourselves how to link carbon markets. With that, that's why the CBAM is such a game changer, because if it does generate more market mechanisms in other countries, even with their teething problems and low prices and all the problems that were in the EU, maybe that's at least some hope. I guess the question is, will it be fast enough? Will it be credible, etc.? But yeah, I think the EU is a nice story.
Good. We have final question from this part of the room.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for looking at this direction. Thank you, Mirabelle. Fantastic presentation. I like very much your not only the research but also the results. It's great to see that the ETS is working so well and delivering all the good things that we wanted it to deliver. But at the same time, there are some other people who are producing results that actually the ETS has had lots of impacts on workers and wages and unemployment and prices, and it has been much more costly than what your research indicates. And so I'm talking about Diego Kancic and this sort of time series approach. So if I go back to home and give a class on this stuff, so how should I make people to understand how these things are compatible?
So I didn't show you the employment result, but definitely in France we find no impact on employment at those level of prices. I think those research probably requires some further looking into. Actually, another one for our list is, in France we are able to see the composition of employment, and I think in complementarity to looking more at sectors, regions, and the type of employment, that could be a really interesting thing to look at. So even if on average we don't find any impact on total employment, I think there's a big question asked of how do we manage, not only through the ETS, but in general for the road to zero, this transition of skills, of employment types, of training, etc. So I think we haven't dug into that, but I think it's an important question. But it could be that it's a reallocation problem. So if firms are not hit on average, then it's a reallocation question, which can be. It's not easy, but it can be dealt with other policies or within the policy.
Thank you again, Mirabelle, for the presentation and for the interesting questions and discussions. I think now it's time for a coffee, finally. No? Oh, sorry.
We can have a coffee now if you wish, but
No.
then we'll go from the...
Okay, yes, then, sorry. Good. Then join me with an applause.